Webinars are hot. As a content marketing professional, I've produced hundreds of videos for social and traditional media platforms and currently work with one of the largest podcast networks in the country. So for me, understanding how webinars work in the B2B space is both essential to my professional development and an exciting form of content creation. According to a study commissioned by digital agency Demandwave, 41% of B2B marketers cite webinars as the best marketing tactic for driving revenue. I've set out to discuss webinars with one of the foremost experts in the field, Matt Lay, president of the Streaming Network in Toronto. Together, we've created this multi-part series of videos and podcasts, the webinar Lessons from the Front Line, or How I Learned to Live with Never Getting a Second Chance with Live Virtual Events. Matt Lay, welcome back to the webinar Lessons from the Front Line. Today's episode is Tips and Tricks, How to Drive Webinar Engagement. I was reading a couple of articles in which you were quoted about creating content that engages. You're a big advocate of engagement metrics. It ultimately boils down to entertaining audiences, right? That's sort of the fundamental thing. So how do we make webinars more entertaining?
Well, I think the simple thing that we do is we move away from what has become the webinar format, because it paramounts to a lecture followed by a Q&A, right? And y'all remember what it was like when you were in university or college or wherever it was. You got lectured, and by the end when they asked, does anyone have any questions, you're pretty much looking to bolt for the door. And that's because you had another class to get to. That's because you maybe weren't all that interested in the topic to begin with. You had to be there, right? And so when we lecture our audience in this day and age, and remembering that they're not in, a conference hall, they're at their laptop, is they've got that next meeting they need to get to, maybe get that coffee, maybe handle that email that they didn't because they were on the webinar.
They've booked an hour.
They booked an hour.
The hour is...
But if they can get 10 minutes back, they will,
Yeah.
right? And so the format, no one likes to be lectured. As good as it is, lectures are not that entertaining.
Yeah.
So it's not something that promotes engagement, if you will. And a webinar should not be a medicine that we have to take, right? It should be something that if we're going to give of our time, we want to be informed, to your point, entertained, but most importantly, get out of it what we hoped to get out of it.
Right.
So I look at engagement and entertainment as two different things. I think they go hand in hand. I think it's important, and the more entertaining or the more enjoyable the presentation style and format is, the more engagement you will get from your audience. But I think engagement, what we really need to drill it down to, is getting that audience to take action. That's what engagement is on the interweb,
Right.
and that's what we want to be promoting in our webinars.
Right. So, and I like your T-shirt, by the way,
Thank you.
Hillary 2016, and we're
Busted out for some reason, right?
we're a non-political podcast here, so I'll be wearing my Make America Great Again baseball cap for the next podcast.
Fair enough.
So, in terms of engagement, then let's focus on that first. What defines engagement in your world? Because engagement can mean any number of things.
Yeah.
This
So-
microphone is engaged. I understand.
So in my world, the way that I feel that engagement is that they're taking action a number of times throughout the webinar can show engagement. So we measure it based around time in webinar and what they've done while they're there. So whether it's our platform or anyone's platform, it's did they ask questions? That shows a level of engagement. If you presented to them options in the form of a poll or a survey or a form field somewhere in the webinar, did they take the time to kind of fill that out or to respond to you? And if you've offered any other CTAs or any other options for them, whether it be to connect with the speaker on LinkedIn, to visit a promotional web page that you've set up on the topic, download an ebook or a resource, each of those things show a level of engagement.
Right.
So it's not just doing one thing, it's doing things throughout the webinar that show that they're there and they're with you. It's like this is the only way in a webinar to make it akin to when you're at a conference and you ask people to raise their hands or you ask people to shout out answers and you do such a good job that the entire audience is shouting stuff out. That's an engaged audience.
Yeah.
The only way you know if your audience is engaged, because they can show their laptops. You're never going to hear them in a webinar.
Yep.
Is if they're clicking and they're taking action throughout.
And you can track all that sort of thing if you've got the right.
Generally
platform.
speaking, yeah, you can track all of that.
Right. So give us some tips then. Tricks and tips. If you've got an hour, you want to get them engaged, you want to be able to measure that. What are like some neat little things you can do as a producer?
Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to give them room. And what I mean by that is you need to give them room to engage. You can't hope that more than, say, 10% of your audience asks a question if you don't have any room for questions to occur.
Right.
And so a big faux pas that people have, regardless of all of the tricks we're going to get to later in this podcast, is that they'll try and jam just way too much content in, or they will prioritize the content that they planned over the questions and the feedback that they're getting from their audience. So they'll have 45 slides or something silly like that, and they're going to need to get through all of that before the end of the webinar, regardless of the types of questions that are coming in. And so what we generally recommend that people do in a 1 hour, let's say, allotted time frame, is they plan for just over 30 minutes of content and hope that the engagement drives the rest of the dialogue.
Right.
There's other things you can do if you don't get that engagement, but still, don't plan for an hour of content.
Right.
And then, I mean, if I was going to talk about it, the first trick that I would say after you've done that is you got to create trust with your audience. And by that I mean there's a distrust that in the internet, because webinar providers like ourselves are doing things like simulating the live experience where no questions are getting answered. There is distrust that people will not answer challenging questions. There's distrust that maybe all of the questions are planted, as that was a trick that we put forward, 10 years ago when, maybe even before that, when Hillary's husband was in office.
Right.
And so you got to create trust so that they know that if they do submit their questions or they do give you feedback, that you are going to reference it. So one thing that we suggest is that regardless of what it is, early on in the webinar, within, I would say, between kind of your introduction and probably after this question in a webinar setting, we would take something from the audience.
Right.
Whether it's a comment about my Hillary shirt or it's a comment about the sign you selected for today, maybe it's a question that we're going to get to anyways, but who cares? Let's just answer it.
Right.
Now that person's got a lot of trust with you, but your entire audience now is like, hey, they're actually going to get back to us on this stuff, so we should submit.
They're starting to think now.
Yeah, they'll start submitting more questions.
Coming up with questions, and,
Yeah.
and it also helps, I guess, break up the pacing, and it does all kinds of
Yeah.
things. So that's great. So what if they still don't engage? What if you try that, like in the middle, nothing comes back, you've tried all your tricks? What then?
Well,
What's the last gasp?
there's a lot of stuff that you can do, right? I mean, but I think that what we usually say to people when they talk about engagement with us, we have a survey that we do. It's called the Webinar Report Card. And we use the first question to find out what people are talking about. Like, what's the number one problem you think you have in your webinar program? And consistently, people say they want their webinars to be more engaging. So it's up there, right? So we have to create an answer for that we can synthesize. And in our synthesized answer for that, or our slogan for it, is that format plus choice equals engagement.
Right.
And what we mean by that is you want to have a format, like I said earlier, a format that provides room for engagement. There are certain types of formats like Q&A that make people feel like they're part of the dialogue. That creates engagement or can drive engagement. But you want to give them choice. The fact that less than 10% of audience members on webinars will submit questions is partly because of how boring webinars have been for so long and how we lecture people and then ask them for questions at the end. But it's also because people in this day and age feel like they should be able to find their own answers, right? They're more prone in the business world to ask Google whether or not they should buy from you than to call you and ask you.
Right.
They're self-educating.
Right.
So we got to give them choice for how they engage with us. And if you're only going to offer them one thing, like the worst is that some people will do like an open chat. The only way someone can engage with you throughout the entire webinar is to participate in an open conversation where their question is seen by other audience members and is out there in the open.
Right.
There's a number of people who just will never do that, right? to do it. So you want to give them choice. Let them ask a question. Let them engage maybe on social media with people. Potentially let them do some of their own research within the console, like webinar experience. We call it a console. Like downloading more facts or more information on the case study, or linking to websites that support what it is that you are talking to. Put out polls that are not part of the dialogue or the conversation, where you're asking them questions while you're going through. We call it non-linear polling. While we're talking, we could be asking the audience certain questions
That they could then be
and they could be
typing.
responding while they're listening. Because if not, you know what you're going to do.
Yeah.
You're going to go to the interwebs. You're going to check Facebook. You're going to check your email while this is going on, and we want to keep them in there. So we need to give them choice. People expect choice. Think about how you get your news now. Your feed is customized to you based around your preferences, and if Google or Yahoo or whoever you use fouls that up, you get a chance of changing it so you're getting the type of news that you want, the type of media you want, people are the same way when they're engaging in a webinar. They want to be able to get the information that they want when they want it.
Right.
So format and choice should, get people engaging on a psychological level as well as that need to click level.
Right. So, I mean, I've never seen, or I can't recall seeing a webinar where PowerPoint didn't play sort of an essential part. Should webinars and this, if you're trying to entertain people, I've sat in meetings and, nothing could get more boring than a poorly presented PowerPoint. But is that a thing? Is PowerPoint an essential part of the webinar experience?
A presentation is. PowerPoint happens to be the ubiquitous Microsoft-based solution that every platform supports from an upload perspective, and so it is generally the base of where a webinar starts.
Right.
But PowerPoint into itself, what is it? It's pictures and it's images. Sometimes it has video. Sometimes it has dancing emojis, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
Is that although it is the base, we want to get away from the idea of the PowerPoint, and we talked about it on an earlier podcast. We want to always put in front of the person the thing that's going to tell our story the best. The video, the image, the stat, with as few words as possible, because we want them listening to us.
Right.
But to answer your question, 90% of the information transmitted to our brains is visual. And by visual, it's the information is being transmitted right now by me, even though it's visual. If they're not listening to this podcast, if they're watching the video version of it, what's being transmitted is that I'm bald, glasses, I supported Hillary in 2016, or whatever it is. The information on webinars is not being transmitted visually. That's where the slides and that's where the presentation come in, right? We want them to retain all of those data points that have been spilling out of my mouth. We want them to retain that information, so the visual is important.
Right.
I would just go back to the fact that, it's not by reading, it's not by words that it's important. 17 bullets on a slide, well, forget that. Even if you're doing it well, 3 or 4 bullets on a slide, that stuff's not being retained when they read it. But if you take that slide and you turn it into an image, right? I've got a slide that I use in my deck that is kind of a weird slide. It's a photo of an old, one of those steel Miller Genuine Draft like advertisements that would have been up in bars, and then now you see them in diners and stuff. And it says "tastes great, less filling," "tastes great and less filling," or whatever it is. And I use it to exemplify that in B2B, we can't synthesize our message to a simple line like "tastes great and less filling." We need a lot of time to explain our value proposition and what it is that we're doing. But that slide is something that people talk to me about when I meet them. And I'll be on a meeting with someone, and they'll ask me, "Do I drink Miller Genuine Draft?" At first, I was like, "What? That's a weird question to be having in a boardroom." But it's because that slide resonated with them. Yeah. The resonation that, yes, we can communicate how complex our message is with just a tweet or just a one-line slogan. We need to go deeper, and that's why webinars are important.
Right.
But that's something that, it is one example of where I've tried stuff that's worked. I'm sure there's many where it hasn't, because there's a lot of slides that people don't talk about. Yeah. But that's one that has really worked for me.
Slides can be very powerful, and they use them in TED Talks, right? Yep. All the great speakers have slides behind them, and those are all PowerPoint as well. So, PowerPoint as a tool can be very powerful, but PowerPoint, when you're just reading ad nauseum from the PowerPoint and it's all words.
Yeah. And in this day and age, I mean, I was shocked when I first heard it, but there still are out there, most of the ones I've encountered are independent contractors who are PowerPoint experts, who, if you've got a compelling story to tell, can sit with you and basically help you tell that story within PowerPoint simply by listening to what it is that you're trying to do. And I've been involved in the process before, where we were producing a virtual event. There was an interim presenter. Oftentimes we're part of a team, a communications team in something. And the PowerPoint guy's just sitting there and he's taking notes and he's basically whatever. And then he comes back with this story that flows through. So if you can't do it yourself, there's even others that can probably be out there to help you do it.
Great, good to know. Okay, time for a challenge.
Sure.
So, what if all of this is a little much? The reality is that there's many successful webinars out there that are actually presented just by an individual who can carry the show and present on their own.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of people listening here going, I don't have time to put this together, but get a microphone in front of me and I'm going to talk to you about my business.
Yeah.
What do you have to say to these folks?
We actually track. It's not in our benchmarks report, but we track the number of people that log into our presenter for a webinar. So we know that there's still a high volume of the solo presenter. And in fact, a good friend of mine at On24, our technology partner, Mark Borenstein, he's a bit of a rock star solo webinar presenter. If you've not seen his work, it's great. And it's him and a microphone, or him and a phone and a PowerPoint. He's managing the slides, he's taking the questions, and he's doing it all himself. So he's a great example of what to do. And he takes, he's a great example and a terrible example. I say he's a terrible example because the guy works for the world's leading webinar platform provider. He's been around for some time in this content marketing, and he's delivered a lot of webinars by himself.
Right.
He's got a lot of experience. So he's terrible because you can't expect anyone just to step in and be as good as him.
Right.
But you can learn from him. The one thing that Mark does that any solo presenter should do is he starts off fairly light, and he always finishes on a serious note. So he'll come in, he'll be laughing, he will say or show something that gets the audience maybe thinking or maybe chuckling and not really on topic. And as he goes through, he gets more serious. And this is a common practice when watching great presenters of any time. He will often put out a question, whether it be in a poll or be in a slide, and he'll let it linger, and then he'll fill in the answers as it goes from there, which is another great example of what solo presenters can do.
Right.
But probably the most important thing about Mark is that he does not take himself very seriously. You know, he's up there, he's taking questions, if he's getting silly comments, he's talking about them. It looks like he's having fun delivering a webinar, and so audience members will watch and they will have a smile on their face, right?
He's a performer, and you got to be ready to perform.
Exactly.
You're going to get up on stage. You're going to perform. You're going to get behind the microphone, do a webinar. You got to perform.
Yeah, I mean, you look at guys who've been in bands for a while, then they go out and do the solo acoustic thing for the first time on a stool, and they feel exposed, even though they've played to stadiums with their bass player and their drummer and everyone around them. It can be very, very similar. And also, if you've never done it before, especially if you're moving to video, that idea of staring down a camera lens and presenting, that way, it's not an easy thing to do. Yeah, I moved away from it years ago, but when I started the business, that's all we did. We set up a camera on sticks, and I sat there and I talked, and shooting content took a long time because I was not a professional. The final thing that I will say about him is, regardless of any trick that he might employ by being good at presenting, is that he's enthusiastic. And enthusiasm, as we know, is contagious. When you see someone who is so passionate about what it is that they're talking about, that they are he's literally excited about webinars. And he was excited about webinars before they were cool again, and that's contagious to an audience. They can see that. So I said he was the good, and I said he was the bad. So here's a flip side of this. I called him my friend, but maybe that's a stretch, but he's a work friend kind of thing. 3-4 years ago, when we started working with them, we were making a big launch in Canada. On24 selected the streaming network to be their Canadian partner. We're taking over the country. We're going to move our customers to their platform. It was a big deal. It was a over $1 million deal for them, and cachet for us. And so we wanted to do, what were we going to do when we do this? We were going to do a webinar, and we wanted to do like a studio webinar. Mark didn't really know us, and flying up wasn't in the cards. So we said that we wanted to do sort of a remote hit interview with myself. We brought in a host, and he wasn't really sure about it. So in the end, what we did was we faked his part of it. He canned it a week before, and he just delivered it kind of didactically to the presentation, and we did it like you would do on CNN with a remote hit and the San Francisco background in the back.
Yeah.
At the time, I mean, it was a really good webinar. So he did that, and then I sat in the studio with the host, and after him, I came in and we had a little chat. I think we still had this thing archived. If you go back to it, you'll notice that in his 15 minutes, he dropped all kinds of science on webinars. It was coming out for us in Canada, and he did a presentation he's delivered 100 times, preeminent thought leader on the subject, where me and the host 15 minutes later, we talked about, I mean, I might have said 2 or 3 things of substance. It was more just nothing.
Yeah.
It was about the partnership. It was about this. I gave some ideas about full service versus self. But what I heard from people was how much more they enjoyed my part of the presentation. Now, sure, that might be people kissing my ass because they were talking to me, but in general, the expectation should have been that they would have talked about how great Mark's part was, because he was the real thought leader we brought in to give people information.
Right.
So there was a perception there that what happened between me and the host, who was very good at his job, he was a comedian, he was awesome, me and that host was more entertaining or more engaging than Mark's awesome presentation
Right.
with all this data points.
There was something real about
Yeah.
your interaction as opposed to a canned presentation.
Exactly, yeah. So,
Which makes sense.
Yeah, so I mean, I still argue to everyone, and I'll be saying it until the day that I'm done, is that get a host, find that person in your organization. They don't got to know the subject matter. In fact, the less they know about the subject matter, the better, because the more real their questions will be.
Yep.
We all get inside baseball when we're interviewing ourselves,
Yep.
or we're too smart for our own good, and have the wrong person in the interviews chair. There's so many benefits to having that host, but like, this is your show, right? So this is your podcast. It happens to be that I'm your guest on this series, but the next series could be with 3 or 4 or 5 different people.
Sure.
It doesn't matter,
Yeah.
right? And so it's you give the audience an understanding of what's going to happen here. They listen into the podcast. You're going to do your introduction, your great introduction that you did for me. You're going to ask me a series of questions to get answers to these questions. And if I'm good and every one of your guests are good, we know that your show gives us what we need.
Yep. Yep.
And so the host, beyond all the things about warm and fuzzies and keeping it on time and helping the process, also makes it feel more like a show. So to wrap this all the way back into your first question about it being entertaining, when you look at what you're doing in a webinar as a show, part of it moves towards that entertainment. So,
Right.
so look at shows, look at podcasts, look at the talk radio shows that you like, or CNN shows. That's all we've done.
They're just bringing another bunch of people in with
Bringing a
with
bunch
opinions.
of people in, they've got their moments, they've got their rants at the end, whatever it is. Create something that has a feel like that people can understand and can trust. Because one of the reasons that we go back and we rewatch shows over and over again, or we always watch the same show, is that we like the procedure. The procedural drama is still a thing, even though we've got these crazy shows on cable and streaming services that no longer follow procedure, but we like them. But the procedure makes people feel comfortable. When Law and Order starts, they know how it's going to end.
Yep.
They don't know who did it, but they know the process that's going to happen. That's how that show is still on TV today. And you want to give those people an understanding of what's happening. They don't want to come to your webinar or your corporate presentation of any sort and be confused
Right.
by the format and what's happening next and what's going on. And a host can help pull that together and make it more of a show that can create that trust and, again, hopefully a following
Right.
for you.
And an
Yeah.
understanding of what the pacing has to be.
Yeah.
That's great. Matthew, thank you so much
No
once
problem.
again. Our next podcast is going to be virtual event bloopers, horror stories from the front lines. Those that are listening do not want to miss this one. This is going to be a ton of fun. Share the podcast with anybody you think may be interested in. Sharing is caring. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thanks so much.
Peter.